Ho ho! Hey guys, and welcome to another fun After Effects tutorial. It's almost Christmas and I've realized I haven't really done an After Effects tutorial in a little while. I also haven't done anything with particles or with text in a little while, so I figured particle text. Genius! Now, jokes aside, in this tutorial I want to show you how to create all sorts of sparkly title text reveals in Adobe After Effects without using any third-party plugins. Now, when it comes to particle effects, I love Red Giant Trapcode Particular, which is probably my favorite particle generator, or BorisFX Particle Illusion, but they are paid third-party plugins and not everybody wants to shell out the additional money. So in this tutorial we will be using CC Particle World, which comes included for free in Adobe After Effects CC. Just be aware that it does have its limitations, but that won't stop us from creating something pretty festive anyway. Now, this is going to be an intermediate level tutorial and I will assume that you have a pretty good grasp on the fundamentals of how Adobe After Effects works. If you're new to everything, I've got a ton of beginner tutorials that I'm going to link you down below, so go and check those out first before you come back here. But now let's make it sparkle and jump right into the tutorial. Welcome to the exciting world of Adobe After Effects. I have a brand new empty project here and I've just imported a single file called flatgold.jpg into my project. This is just this gradient golden background that I've created. And as always, if you do want to follow along with this tutorial, you will be able to download this file from our website. So simply go to surfacedstudio.com/downloads and you will be able to grab this file for free so you can follow along. But let's get started and create a new composition. I'm going to call this one Glitter Text. Leave the resolution on 1920 by 1080 at 24 frames per second. And I'm going to set the duration to exactly 10 seconds. But as always, just feel free to tweak anything I show you in this video to your liking to create your own little glitter text title. Let's hit OK. Let's come up to the toolbar, click into our composition, and let's simply place down some text. Let's position it in kind of the center upper third of our composition, and you can always use the align panel to make sure that that is perfectly centered. If you can't see any of the panels that I'm showing you here, you can simply come up to your main menu and under window you can enable or disable all of these different panels. Now, it doesn't matter which font you use. The one I'm using is called Berlin Sans FB, which is this nice solid text right here. I'm just going to scale up my text just a little bit. Then I'm going to grab my flatgold.jpg image and drop that right into the backdrop. Now this will fit exactly on my composition at 1920 by 1080. If it doesn't, you can simply kind of scale this down or hit Ctrl, Alt and F or Command, Option and F if you're on a Mac to fit that image right into your composition. So that's now kind of our backdrop. But I kind of want to stencil this text out of this backdrop. And for that, with my flat gold layer selected, let's come into the Effects and Presets panel and search for the CC Glass effect. Let's apply the effect to the flat gold background layer. And in the effects panel, let's pop open the surface settings. Let me just make this a little bit bigger so you can see. Let's change the bump map from flat gold over to glitter text because we want to stencil our text out of this golden layer. Now this is going to create this little bevel. I'm actually going to hide my text layer so you can see this a little bit better. It's going to create this little golden bevel stencil out of this background layer. Let me just zoom in a little bit so you can see this a little bit clearer. In the CC Glass effect settings, I'm going to lower the softness to probably around 6 or so. I want this to be just a little bit more of a solid kind of stencil. I'm going to jack the height up to maybe around 90 or so, and then just set the displacement to a couple of hundred, maybe 300 or so. So that's going to offset the actual displacement along the edges a little bit. And yeah, that kind of looks nice. However, I don't actually want the rest of this background to be visible. So in my layer window, I'm going to press F4 to reveal my track matte options. I'm going to set the track matte on my flat gold background layer to alpha matte. So essentially cutting this text out of the backdrop. And now we've got this really nicely stenciled gold glitter text that we're going to use. Let's select all layers with Ctrl or Command and A, Ctrl Shift and C to pre-compose those layers. Let's call this one text comp and hit OK. So now we've got this little golden text created, but let's give it a little bit of a background to rest on. For that, let's just simply create a new solid layer. Let me call this one background and I'm going to change the color over to black. Hit OK. Make sure the background sits below our text comp. In the Effects and Presets panel, let's search for the gradient ramp effect. Let's apply that to the background layer and just zoom out just a tad. In the effect settings for the gradient ramp, I'm going to change the ramp shape from linear ramp over to radial. So you end up with this little radial gradient here. The start color, I'm actually going to change to like a really darkish blue. I just want a very faint blue background because I think the yellow on blue will look quite nice. End color, I'm going to change to black. I'm just going to drag the start point down and the end point up to create this really, really soft, rather faint little blue gradient. I think that kind of looks nice. And to reduce all of this ugly banding that we have, make sure you increase the ramp scatter. I'm going to jack this up to, I don't know, close to 200 or something. It introduces a little bit of noise into the background, but that also then gets rid of all of these ugly gradient bands. So that actually looks pretty nice. And let's get started adding some of those cool particles. For that, let's create a new solid in our composition. I'm going to call this layer Star Particles. Hit OK. I'm going to place this layer at the top, so it's going to cover up everything else. But now in the Effects and Presets panel, let's search for the CC Particle World effect. And this one comes inbuilt with Adobe After Effects. Let's apply this effect to our Star Particles layer. And if you scrub through your composition, this is essentially just a very simple particle emitter that spews a whole bunch of particles out. And we now need to customize and tweak this to make this little stars that kind of start emitting around the shape of our text. First off, hover your mouse over the exact center of this emitter here and it turns into this little pointy cursor. I hope you can see that. And that allows you to change the position of the emitter. Let's grab that, pull that up right into the center of our text. Then come into the effects settings for the CC Particle World effect and expand the producer options. And this is where you can tweak the position as well if you're having trouble grabbing it with your mouse. Let's increase the radius X a little bit to make the particle emitter a bit wider to span just a little bit more than our text. Make the Y radius just a little bit bigger as well. I think that's actually not too bad in terms of where the particles will be emitting. Let's check this out. And yep, that's not too bad, but let's change the actual particle type from these lines over to something that looks a little bit more glittery. So again, in the settings for the CC Particle World effect, let's expand the particle tab. Let's change the particle type from line to textured quad polygon. Now all of our particles have vanished because we haven't actually assigned a texture to them yet. So right now they're all invisible. In the particle settings, under the particle type, you now have this texture tab enabled. And if you expand that, that's actually going to ask you for a texture layer to define what those particles look like. We don't have one yet, so let's create one. Let's return to our project panel and let's create a new composition. I'm going to call this one Star Comp. I'm going to change the width to 400 and height of 400. And you can create whatever texture you want for your particles. You can import images or even videos, anything you want really. Let's just hit OK. So this is going to be our particle. And I'm just going to use the shape tools to create a little star. So let's come to the toolbar. And here under the rectangle tool, if you click and hold, there's a whole bunch of other options. Let's select the star tool. Over on the right hand side, under the option for the shape tool, I'm going to set my fill to white. Just make sure that your stroke the color doesn't really matter. Just make sure that it's set to 0 pixel width because we don't want an outline around our star itself. I'm also going to press Alt and single quote or Option and single quote to show this grid so I can see the exact center of my composition. I'm going to click into that and drag out to create this little star shape. By the way, while you're dragging, you can actually scroll your mouse wheel up or down to add and remove more spikes to it. If you hold down Control and move your mouse, you can actually control how spiky the star is going to be. Now I want a fairly cute, rounded-ish star, but I'm just going to pull this out a little bit. Let go of Control or Command and then zoom in. Just kind of get this nice little star shape right in the center. That actually looks quite nice. So this is now our star. Alt or Option and single quote to hide that grid again. And that actually looks pretty nice. Now we could add all sorts of animations or effects right here and all of the star particles would follow those animations and effects, but let's just keep it nice and simple for this tutorial. Let's return to our glitter text composition, grab the star comp we've just created and drop that into our glitter text. We can actually hide the visibility of that. We don't actually need to see it. Let's reselect our star particles layer. Come to the effect controls, where we have the CC Particle World effect, reselect the effect, and now under the particle settings, we can actually change the texture layer here over to be our star comp. And now we have all of these cool star particles. Let's rewind and play this back. And that actually looks pretty good. Now it's way too fast. I also don't like that all of these particles are kind of flipped on their side a little bit. And that's because we have rotation enabled right here. And the rotation axis is any axis. Now let's change this any axis over to the Z axis, which is actually the one that's pointing into the screen. So now these particles will only rotate around you know, the axis that is facing the viewer, so they'll always be facing the camera. This kind of looks a little bit nicer. It looks a little bit more cute. But again, just customize this in any way that you want. Now let's tweak the emission itself. It's a lot too fast and it's kind of just, I don't know, it just doesn't look very festive. So let's come into the physics tab. Let's change the animation from explosive over to fractal omni, just a little bit more of a gentle emission. I also don't like that they're shooting out a little bit too strongly, so I'm going to lower the velocity to maybe 0.2 or 0.3, somewhere around there. And I'm going to lower the gravity so they feel lighter, like they're just kind of floating down rather than just dropping like a rock. So let's lower the gravity to maybe 0.1 or something. Let's just rewind and play this back. Yeah, that's much nicer. I could almost go a little bit lower on the gravity, maybe 0.6 or 0.7. Cool, and that actually looks pretty nice. Now let's tweak their look a little bit because they're just a little bit plain looking. It's just not as nice as they could be. So let's come down to the particle settings again. Now all of these particles have a birth size and a death size, which is kind of the change in size to the particle over the span of their life. I actually want all of these particles to kind of fizzle out and get really small towards the end. So I'm going to change the depth size to 0. So all going to fade down to like 0 size, but I'm going to bring the birth size up a little bit, maybe 0.3, something around there. Let's rewind, play this back. Cool, that looks really good. I'm actually going to bring up the size variation to maybe around the 70% or so. So you get some bigger and some smaller particles. Max opacity, I'm going to drag up to 100 because I want them to be pretty bright and strong and solid. Now you can actually transition your particles color from its birth to its death. Right now all of these are disabled because we are using a textured quad polygon. If you want to enable these options here to control the color over the life of the particle, you can either change them in your star particle comp, or you can change the particle type over to textured square or disk or faded disk. And these allow you to then control the color with this color map down here, but you lose some options around rotation. So you win some, you lose some. For now, this white is just fine with me. Now, I do want these particles to come in a little bit quicker. They're kind of fading in right now. For that, I'm going to expand the opacity map inside my particle settings here. And you've got a little curve that describes how the opacity of these particles changes over the size of their life. Now, I'm actually going to redraw this curve. You can just click and hold and drag and repaint this curve. I kind of want them to spike up and become opaque quite quickly. I'm just going to drag all the way over to the right. I can keep them fully opaque until the end of their life because they're going to end at a size of 0. So they're kind of fading out just because they get smaller. They don't actually need to get less opaque. So let's rewind again and play this back. Cool, that's looking really nice. Now these particles just keep on coming and keep on coming all the way through to the end. But I actually want them to appear slowly and kind of start coming in. And then around the 3-4 seconds, I kind of want them to fade back out and stop emitting, just so we can actually have this text appear. So let's come to the beginning, 0 seconds. Come up in our CC particle world effect, and let's place a keyframe on the birth rate. Let's just start this out at 0. Let's go forward to about a second in and set the birth rate to maybe 2. With the star particles layer selected, press U to reveal all of the properties that have keyframes on them. And so you can see the keyframes right here. Let's select both of them, press F9 to enable Bezier interpolation. Let's move forward. Maybe from 4 to 5 seconds, we're going to have to fade these ones back out. So let's place another keyframe at about 4 seconds, come forward to 5 seconds. Let's bring the birth rate back down to 0. So the particles are going to stop emitting just around that time. This gives us plenty of time to have the text appear and then kind of just stand on its own for a little while. So the particles actually look pretty nice. I'm quite happy with those. The last thing I want to do is enable motion blur on them. So for that, in our layer window, let's press F4 again to reveal the layer switches, enable motion blur for the star particles comp. And in newer versions of After Effects, that will automatically enable motion blur on your whole composition as well. If you're on an older version, just make sure you enable this switch as well. So you get motion blur on the stars and you just get a little bit as they're dropping here. It just looks a little bit smoother and nicer that way. And now we need to create the effect of this text actually coming in. And there's lots of different ways to do this, but I kind of want it to be revealed as if, the stars were kind of leaving imprints on this text. And so the text kind of slowly comes into being from that. For that, we're going to reuse the star particles layer, but we're going to tweak it a little bit. So let's select the star particles layer, Control or Command and D to duplicate it. Let's rename this layer to text matte. drag it below the star particles layer. We want it to sit right on top of the text that we want to reveal. I'm actually going to temporarily hide the star particles layer on top as well. I actually just want to see the particles from the text mat here. Let's reselect the CC particle world effect. And I want this emitter to be a little bit bigger to make sure we're covering the entire area of our text. So let's expand the producer. I'm just going to jack up the X radius and the Y radius a little bit, just so we have enough area covered to create our stars. Also, I don't actually want these stars to be falling. I want them to be spawned in one position, and then kind of just expand and start filling in this area of the text. So let's expand the physics. Let's bring down the velocity to 0 and set the gravity to 0 as well. Now, I also don't want these stars to ever vanish. I want them to kind of stick around forever. So I'm going to come up and set the longevity from 1 second over to 10. Now, while the rotating worked really nicely for the star particles that are falling, for these ones, I don't actually want them to rotate. Otherwise, it's going to constantly create some movement in how this text gets revealed. So let's expand the particle options and change the rotation speed to 0. And I'm also going to set the initial rotation to 0. So they're all kind of nicely aligned. Now, I want to make sure that this essentially becomes solid white, so our full text is revealed. And for that, I think I need just more particles. So with the text matte layer selected, press U to reveal all of the keyframes. Press J to jump to the second keyframe here. And let me change the birth rate to maybe 20 or something. I do want quite a lot of particles being emitted, and that might make the rendering a little bit slower. Let's come to about 4 seconds here. And again, let's make sure that is 20 as well. So throughout this time, we're emitting a lot, like a lot of particles. And it does look pretty good. Now, we could either add more particles to fill in the rest of the holes, or we can just make these star particles grow a little bit rather than get smaller over their life. So let's change the depth size on these particles to maybe 1 or something. Again, I do want this to be solid white at the end. Also, I don't think I want my stars to fade in. I actually want them to appear from a tiny size. So let's bring the birth size down to 0. And in our opacity map, they can actually just be solid. So I'm going to paint this out so they're always solidly visible. They're just going to start really small and then just kind of keep growing and growing and growing. And probably around here is when I'd want the full text to be visible. So let me bring up the depth size a little bit, maybe to 1.5, 1.6 or something. So I think that actually should work pretty well. Let's come back to our layers. Again, make sure the text matte particles layer sits right above your text comp. Press F4 to reveal the modes and the track matte. And then on the text comp, let's change the track matte from none over to alpha matte. And now what should happen is essentially you get all of these tiny stars appear, and then they kind of grow and fill this text to reveal our glitter text. And this is actually a pretty cool effect, especially once we re-enable all of our star particles. So let's re-enable those. Let's rewind and check this out. Cool, I think that's looking really nice. Now I do want the color of all of these particles to match, and I want to add a bit of a glow. And there's different ways of doing this. Personally, I recommend just select your text comp, the text matte, as well as the star particles. Control Shift and C or Command Shift and C if you're on a Mac. This is going to pre-compose those layers, and let's call this one glitter text comp. Let's hit OK. Double click at the glitter text comp that we've just created to jump into it. And in older versions of After Effects, just make sure you still have the motion blur switches enabled on your particles as well as this composition. I think newer versions of After Effects automatically retain this option, but older versions may have just dropped that one. Let's come back to our project panel and grab another copy of this flat gold layer. Grab that and drag that into this composition, place it at the very top. Make sure you can see your mode and track matte options, so press F4 if you can't. And there's this little column here, T, that actually means to preserve the opacity of the layers below. So if you disable this and enable your transparent background, you can see that most of this composition is actually transparent. It's just the stars and the text itself that aren't. So if you now re-enable this flat gold at the top and check this little option here to preserve transparency on it, you're essentially stenciling out this layer. Let me disable the grid again. So now this layer is essentially, it's like you've pre-composed all of them and used them as a track matte on this, but this is just kind of an easier way of doing just that. Now we've lost the little bevel on the text, so let's change the mode on this flat gold layer at the very top from normal over to multiply. Let's rewind and check this out. Cool, that's looking really good. Let's return to our glitter text comp, and this is kind of almost at the final effect. Let's just come into the Effects and Presets panel and let me search for a glow effect. And let's just use the one that comes with After Effects. So this is the Stylize Glow effect. Let's just apply that to the glitter text comp. A little bit too strong. Let's bring the threshold up to maybe around 70, 80. Again, tweak this to your liking. Go to bring the radius up a little bit and the intensity down, because I think it's just a little bit too much. You can go too strong pretty easily. And it looks nice. It's just a little bit too saturated. So let's just search for another effect. Let's use the color correction hue and saturation effect. Let's apply that to the layer. I'm just going to bring the master saturation down a little bit. I just want a subtle, like I liked some color. I just don't want it to be too much. So that I think looks pretty nice. Maybe just a little bit more color there. And what I'm going to do as well is just once these stars start fading out, I'm actually going to fade off this glow intensity. So maybe around 3.5 seconds or so. Let's come up in the settings for the glow effect, enable keyframes for the intensity. Let's come to maybe about 5.5 seconds. Lower the intensity to 0, so the glow is actually going to fade out right there. Press U to reveal the keyframes, select them, F9 to enable Bezier interpolation. So you kind of end up with this final, you know what, maybe it'll leave a little bit of glow, maybe 0.1 or 0.2. I just want a little bit of glow still on it. Just not a lot, just a little bit. So it just looks a little bit more lively. And yeah, maybe a little bit too oversaturated. So again, saturation down a little bit. But as I've said, tweak this to your liking. You can do whatever you want with this. And now let's rewind, collapse all of our layers, and let's play back our final glitter text effect. And that's all there is to it. If you enjoyed this tutorial, please hit that like button. If you're new here, hit that subscribe button. And don't forget to enable that little bell so you actually get notified. If you do have any comments, questions, or suggestions, just leave them down in the comment section below. And as always, thank you very much for watching. And until next time, I will see you later.